All right, so basically what this seminar is going to be about is how to build a culturally sensitive classroom, right? So as instructors, what is our ethical responsibility to our students, right? To make sure that they feel welcome and that it's a diverse space for them, and to know that, that this is a safe space. So basically what the exercise we're going to be doing is we're going to write an autobiography, okay, based on how certain other forces built your life story of how you came to immigrate to the United States, right? So essentially everybody in North America is an immigrant, less of course obviously if you're indigenous, in which case again your story is obvious. How did migration to this continent affect your life, your family's life, etc.? And how, you know, you can go back as many generations as you feel you need to. So basically what we'll do is first we'll take a short period of time where we're going to write out that autobiography. Because we're time limited in this particular instance, we won't necessarily write it all out in prose. What I'm going to ask you to do is just go ahead and outline a few points, and then afterwards we'll pair up and share that with each other, discuss some of the salient points of your autobiography, and then after that we'll present it to the class. Now I'll begin first by just basically modeling for you what that autobiography might look like. So I'm an interesting example because I'm of Korean ancestry, right? And what that means is I'm your quintessential model minority, right? So given that I'm a model minority, it's still very interesting to look at how is it that I came to the United States, right? So the direct reason why we immigrated here was because my father was disappeared and tortured twice by the intelligence services of South Korea, right? And during that time, through all of South Korean history, from 1948 all the way up until the 1990s, there was no democracy, right? We kind of think of maybe only North Korea as being that way. Actually, South Korea was ruled by a series of dictators and generals as well, like military juntas. And so essentially, South Korea was a de facto CIA state, right? So to this day, the CIA station chief has more power than the president of South Korea. What that means is, for example, if there's any military engagement with North Korea, you have to get the permission of the CIA station chief, right? And that still holds today. So given this kind of context is, and what's interesting is the fact that my father being disappeared and tortured twice was very interesting because actually his adoptive father was the head of South Korean intelligence services, J.P. Kim, who went on to become prime minister twice, right? Once in the 90s and then once again in the 2000s when that group came back into power. So that's fascinating, considering that somebody even with considerable political influence and privilege was still disappeared. And what that means to be disappeared is the way intelligence services works is there's like cells. So each of the cells don't know what the other cells are doing. So even as the director of intelligence, it took him all night long to figure out where he was disappeared to. So given that kind of a history of what it means even as a model minority, right? The kinds of histories of violence, power, that would bring somebody to come to the United States as some sort of refugee. Now, I don't mean refugee in the definition of like the UN definition, but for example, people fleeing from South America or Mexico often are called economic refugees, right? So capital can cross borders, but people are not allowed to, right? So as a direct result of things like NAFTA and international trade agreements, this is what displaced peasant farmers, made their lives unlivable. They had to flood to the cities and then eventually flood to the US. So what is the role then that power plays, right, in shaping our lives, the autobiography, and also how does that shape how you came to this country? So if you guys want to take a few minutes now and then go ahead and write down a few, just sort of do an outline for now, but it can be up to probably up to 5 to 7 pages to do the full autobiography as relates to, so what are some of the isms that we might want to look at? So the kind of obvious ones, racism, sexism, right? So issues of gender. So there are at least 6 biological sexes. I've seen as high as 18 to 19, right? So that's why when we talk about the difference between sex and the difference between gender, gender is socially created. So how do those things such as, you know, heteronormativity, so your sexual orientation, your class, whether you come from the lower classes, working class, upper class, how did that shape and impact how the privileges that you had? So again, my being able to flee South Korea, I was 2 years old, and my family being able to leave was also a form of privilege. They were extremely wealthy, and my aunt had married a US serviceman. So once again, how does power shape access to this country when we're talking about, okay, so you have to marry into a military that's occupying your country in order to have access to flee the repression that's brought to you by that military force that's occupying your country. So these are the kinds of convoluted strands of power and privilege or lack of privilege that might dictate how one of your students is coming to this country. So the most obvious and dramatic example these days is Guatemala, right? So you look at Central America and the number of proxy wars that have been fought there by the United States, the State Department, and the CIA over the past, since 1954 when they overthrew Arbenz, and how they've been flooding that country now for decades, obviously really ramped up in the 80s. And so how does that then affect how Guatemala was shaped today? How does that affect refugees coming here from there?